Hello everyone, and thank you for these introductions. And thank you all for being present today during this defense. I'm going to introduce you my PhD work to go towards the exploitations of mental workload assessment in virtual reality systems. So my PhD is supervised by Anatoly Cuyer, and this PhD was funded by the Institute of Research and Technology BICOM. So I was also supervised by Guillaume Jégou, Fernand Guélaguette, and Nicolas Martin. VR systems are becoming increasingly popular in many fields, whether it is in the entertainment field, for video games, for example, whether it is in the therapeutical field, for example, to treat PTSD, phobia, or anxiety, or in the training field to simulate complex real-world situations. I'm going to put the focus a little bit more on the training field today. And well, VR is particularly convenient in the training field as it provides an opportunity for people to train in environments that are otherwise impossible, far too risky, or far too expensive. So if the video will start. So we had an example, for example, for fire workers. So basically, this is a very dangerous situation, and VR is going to be able to simulate this kind of situations in a safe way. Research has shown that VR could improve learning retentions compared to more traditional supports, for example, compared to computer screens or compared to paper and pencil supports. And this is particularly important in fields such as in the aviation industries, as you have lives at stake. And the goal of most of these VR applications usually are to train users in order to decrease the number of workplace accidents and or to improve the user's learning performances. The issue is that these studies are mostly interested in learning and task performance outcomes. So they want to make sure that the training applications are going to be efficient. And most of the time, they are not going to take into account the user's cognitions or physiological measures in their VR applications, which is where quite important as human factors is one of the main issue in and the main cause of flight accidents. And this is also the case in VR training applications. So what we want to do actually is to adapt VR applications content based on the user psychological state. And more particularly, we want to adapt the VR application based on the user's mental workload. So we want to go towards the exploitations of mental workload measures in VR applications in order to make the applications more fitted to the users. I'm going to explain a little bit what is mental workload. So actually, mental workload is a psychological concept, which is quite easy to understand, but a little bit hard to define. There is no real consensus over its definitions, even if some parts stay the same in most of these definitions. I'm going to give you a descriptions made by Weekends in 2002. So mental workload describes the relations between the quantitative demand for resources imposed by a task and the ability to supply those resources by the operators. So in most definitions, you often have, on the one hand, the user's cognitive resources, and you have, on the other hand, the task cognitive demands. So if I ask you to solve these equations, so find x for 4x equal 2, you're likely to be underloaded because, well, you will agree with me, it is very easy. And if I ask you to do this task, you will have a lot of remaining cognitive resources left. On the other hand, if I ask you to solve these equations, and well, I can promise you that it's going to be very difficult and you're likely to be overloaded. So this is a Fermat-Last theorem, and actually you don't have any solutions. So you won't be able to do another task in parallel to this task. So mental workload is a variable that we want to keep under control, whether it is to keep the users focused and engaged in their task, or whether it is to train users to situations where they might be overloaded. Our objective is to go towards the exploitations of mental workload in virtual reality systems. And for that, we decided to decompose the research axis in three. First, we have the inductions of mental workload in VR. Then we have the recognitions of mental workload in VR. And then we have the exploitations of mental workload in VR. For the inductions of mental workload in VR, we are going to focus on the influence or the effect of VR stimuli on the user's mental workload responses. So we are going to be able to measure the user task performance measures, for example, and physiological measures, for example. For the recognition of mental workload, we are going to focus on doing and working on a recognition model, which is going to be able to recognize the user's super subjective mental workload level or perceived mental workload level without asking the users how they are feeling. So we want to use objective measures, And we want to use these objective measures to be able to recognize the user's subjective mental workload level automatically. For the exploitations of mental workload, we are going to use the recognized mental workload level or mental workload measures, and we are going to try to adapt VR stimuli in order to induce a targeted mental workload level. So it's going to be the adaptation logic. So we did 3 main contributions and 5 user studies, starting with a study of mental effort in virtual versus in real environments. So we did 2 user studies, and we wanted to study the effect of wearing a VR HMD on the user's mental effort. So we just targeted the induction part of the loop in this case. For the second contributions, we proposed a methodology to introduce mental workload assessment in the design of VR training scenarios. So we targeted the induction part because we wanted to see the interaction effect between different types of tasks in VR. And we targeted the exploitations of mental workload because we wanted to use mental workload assessment in order to be able to modulate the user's mental workload over time. For the third contributions, we focused on proposing an all-in-one solutions to do the real-time recognition of mental workload using physiological sensors integrated into VRHMD. So first, I'm going to introduce you a little bit of state of the art, and starting with the introduction of mental workload in VR, then the recognition, and finally the exploitations. For the induction of mental workload in VR, we can decompose work studying the induction into 2 categories. First, methods of inductions. So those are going to be used in order to study human behaviors or differences between 2 or more conditions, considering, for example, the mental workload level or cognitive task performances. So there are going to be methods which are going to be able to modulate the user's mental workload levels, and we are going to be able to use them, for example, to train mental workload recognition models. For the second point, so we are going to focus on factors influencing mental workload in VR. So we are going to study what is the effect of some parameters and some factors on mental workload measures. For methods of inductions, so we mainly have cognitive tasks used in VR. So you have, for example, spatial manipulation tasks. So we are going to make use of the 3D in VR to manipulate 3D objects. And we are going to measure task performances and different mental workload measures. You have some studies which adapted the Stroop test in VR. And you have the very famous NBAT task, which is relying on the working memory, the user's working memory. And we are going to be able to modulate the difficulty of the NBAT task very easily to induce different mental workload levels. So I have quite a lot of studies on this task, which are all standardized. And you have a lot of other cognitive tasks, but I'm not going to detail all of them today. As for factors influencing mental workload in VR, you have redirected walking, which was found to increase cognitive demands depending on the angle of the redirections. You have the control of a self-avatar, which was found to influence the user's cognitive task performance, considering a later recall task. And you have the avatar appearance, which can influence the user's mental workload levels. So being embodied in Einstein's body is going to increase the user's cognitive task performance compared to being embodied into a normal looking avatar. So one question we might ask is, well, we consider most of the time single standardized task in VR to be able to modulate the user's mental workload, but how it is when we want to consider multitasking? Because we are going to be able to stimulate different cognitive resources in the brain. So we would like to propose a way to use multitasking to induce mental workload in VR. And that's going to be one of the points we are going to treat in the second contribution. As for factors influencing mental workload in VR, we might be asking already, is using VR devices and being immersed in a virtual reality environment is going to have an influence on the user's mental workload measures? And that's going to be the research question of the first contribution. For the recognitions of mental workload in VR, so I'm going to present you the different methods to measure mental workload in VR. So this is not an easy task, and many of these measurement methods have advantages and disadvantages, which can be discussed. So you have the very popular self-report methods. So basically, those are going to be questionnaires, and we are going to ask users how they are feeling. So you have the very, very famous NASA TLX, developed by Hart and Staveland in 1988. you have the subjective workload assessment techniques, and both of them are going to be multidimensional scales. So they're going to take time to answer, but they are very high, they are very qualified to measure the user's mental workload. So they are very detailed. And you have unidimensional scale, which are quicker to respond and which have found proved their validity, such as, for example, the ISA scale and the rating scale of mental effort. We can also measure the user's task performances, so the accuracy and the reaction time, but it's going to be a little bit less sensitive to the user's mental workload. And you can analyze the facial expression of the users, the body gestures, and for example, for the eye behaviors, the number of blinks and the fixation durations. A very, very popular way to measure the user's mental workload in VR and outside VR is to use the psychophysiological measures. So psychophysiological measures are going to be physiological responses to psychological processes. So we can measure, for example, the brain activity of the users using EEGs. We can measure the brain activity using FNIRS. We can measure the skin conductance level using epidermal activity sensors. We can measure the user's heart rate activity, and we can also measure the user's pupil diameter. Usually, what we are going to do is to use data fusion methods to classify the user state. So this was proposed by Rosa and Picard from the MIT in 2001 for emotions particularly. And basically, it means that we are going to take the physiological signals, we are going to extract physiological features, and then we are going to take these features in order to try to classify the user's emotions and psychological states. So there are more and more works and companies which are trying to integrate the physiological sensors directly into the VRHMD because, well, it is more convenient to just deal with one headset and not all of the user sensor wires and everything. So, for example, you have the MIT Media Lab, which developed the PhysioHMD, which is a module which can be integrated into VRHMD and AR headset. So the integrated EEG sensors, epidermal activity sensors, and other kind of sensors. OpenBCI and Valve are working on a VR headset which integrate EEG sensors. So this is a work in progress, which should be presented in the following years. And you have a lot of other headsets which integrate EEG sensors, such as, for example, Neurable or Lucid VR. And as you know, there are a lot of headsets which integrate eye tracking solutions. So the Vive Pro Eye, Fove, and a lot more. One question we might ask is, among all of these measures, which kind of measures should we take into account to try to recognize the user's mental workload in VR? Which one works the best? So should we consider skin conductance level? Should we consider heart rate activity or task performance measures to try to recognize the user's mental workload? Also, does integrating the sensors directly inside the VRHMD has an impact on the mental workload recognitions, since this is something that is interesting us? So we don't know if it's going to have to be more robust or not, or if it's going to be to decrease or increase the mental workload recognition accuracy. In the literature, we didn't really see in the past work which dealt with the recognition in real time in VR. And that's something that we are going to try to tackle in the third contribution. For the exploitations of mental workload in VR, we can decompose them in two categories. So as a reminder, the exploitation is going to correspond to the adaptive logic. And so we can have explicit feedback and we can have implicit feedback. In both cases, we are going to measure the user's physiological activities or other objective measures. So for example, task performances. And we are going to use these measures in order to adapt the virtual environments. And in the case of the explicit feedback, the user is going to be aware that the feedback they are receiving in the virtual environments are going to be based on their physiological signals or the other objective measures. And in the case of the implicit feedback, the user is not going to be aware that their measures are going to be used to adapt and to provide feedbacks from the virtual environment. So we can decompose and subdivide the explicit feedback into two categories. The very famous biofeedback categories. So in this case, we are going to focus on especially physiological signals or biosignals, and we are going to ask the user or to invite the users to control their physiological signals based on the feedback which is presented in the virtual environments. So it is quite a lot used in the clinical and therapeutical field, for example. So we have Van Woogy and colleagues who try to regulate or to try to invite children to regulate their anxiety. So here you can see a circles in the center, and this circles is going to vary in size based on the user's brain activity. For the second subcategories, we have physiological displays, and in this case, we are just going to have a direct feedback of the physiological activities in either the user interfaces or either in the experimental interfaces or in another user interfaces. So in this case, the user is not going to be invited to try to control their physiological signals. It's just going to be informative. For example, you have a Dee and colleagues study. So they developed a multi-user applications, and in these applications, one of the users had a feedback of the other user heart rate activity. So the feedback was mostly informative, and it communicated the physiological state of the other user to one of the users. For the implicit feedback, so I'm going to focus on VR training. So most of the studies focus on adapting a single task difficulties based on the user's task performances. For example, on the left, you can see Grimm and colleagues study where they adapted the distance between the basket and the ball based on the user's task performance. And you have other studies which adapted the difficulty of a single task based on physiological signals. So in this case, Dee and colleagues studies adapted the visual search task difficulty based on the EEG alpha band power. One question we might ask is, how do we adapt the immersive virtual environment contents in the case where we have multiple tasks in parallel? So how do we adapt immersive virtual environment in complex contexts? Should we decrease or increase the difficulty of one specific task or another task, depending on the task performance? And how do we take into account the user's perceived mental workload level? So task performance is not very sensitive sometimes to the user's mental workload, and this was proven by Dee and colleagues study. And so we are going to tackle this question in the second contribution. I'm going to start now detailing the contributions and some of the results we obtained during the PhD. So I'm going to focus on the main results. So for the first contributions, we studied the user's mental work effort in virtual reality. And we wanted to answer these questions. So does being immersed in virtual environments using a VR HMD is going to influence the user's mental effort? So we did the first experiment where we had 27 participants, and we went a little bit further. So we did the qualifying studies with 25 participants. So we manipulated 3 independent variables. So starting with the n-back task. So we had the 1-back task, the 2-back task, and the 3-back task. So we had 3 difficulty levels. And we asked users to press the trigger button of the Vive controller if and only if the letters they heard in the audio headset was the same as the nth previous one. So the user heard sequences of letters, and for example, for the 2-back task, if the users heard A, B, A, they had to press the trigger button because A was the same letter as the second previous one, etc. So similarly. And we manipulated so the secondary task, the presence or not of a secondary task. So the users were either sitting or walking, and the environment. So the users were either in the real environments or in the virtual reality environments. And those were within subject conditions. So in the sitting X real environments, the user heard sequences of letters in the audio headset. They were seated in front of a TV, and they could see the difficulty of the n-back task displayed on the TV. After each difficulty of the n-back task, they were asked to report their mental effort on a scale. So I'm going to detail you a little bit more the collected data afterward. In the virtual reality conditions, so sitting XVR conditions, as you can see, we did a very high fidelity representations of the real environments in VR. And it was exactly the same task. So you had the difficulty of the n-back task displayed on the virtual TV, and they still heard the sequences of letters in the audio headset. In the working X-ray environments, we asked the user why they were doing the n-back task to walk in circles in the orange rectangle. They were asked to walk at their own pace, so in a very natural way, so it didn't really bother them. And in the VR conditions, so as you can see, everything was calibrated. So when they worked in the virtual environment, they should have the same feedback as in the real conditions. So we collected several types of measures, starting with the subjective mental effort using the rating scale of mental effort. So they had to rate their mental effort between 0 and 150, and then to click on the following buttons to start another task. We also collected the user's and back task performance, so we recorded the accuracy. And we also recorded the pressure exerted on the trigger button while they were doing the then back task. So we did a homemade sensor with an Arduino card to send the data to the computer and a force-sensitive resistance sensor. And we also recorded the user's response time to the end back task. We also assessed the user's heart rate activity and the skin conductance level, but only in the first experiment and not in the second one. So on the left, you can see the rating scale of mental effort, so the measures of the user's subjective mental effort. And on the right, you can see the task performance measures. So here are the result in the real conditions. And as you can see in the virtual conditions, so we didn't find a significant effect of the environments on the user's mental effort and on the accuracy. So wearing a VRHMD, considering the sitting and walking condition, didn't increase the user's mental effort. We found out that walking significantly increased the user's mental effort, which was to be expected because when the user was walking, so it was a secondary task, but still it was a very easy task. And the fact that it significantly increased the user's mental effort means that we have to control the amount of interactions we have in the virtual environments. So in the second experiment, we wanted to take a step further. So we fixed some variables. So the walking task, and we only consider the walking task and the two-back task. And we wanted to make sure that in these conditions, considering only the walking task and the two-back task, we wouldn't have any effect of the environments. So it was a qualifying studies. Also, we wanted to find out if after having put on the VRHMD, the user were going to experience more mental effort or not, because they will have to be accommodated to the virtual environment. So here are the result, and as you can see, so this is an indicator of time somehow in the virtual condition and real conditions, and we didn't find any effect of the accommodations to VR on the user's mental effort. So here we could have expected this point to be higher, considering the mental effort, but it was not the case. It was very stable inside the same environment for the two-back task. But in these conditions, we found out that we had an effect of the environment on the user's mental effort, considering only the walking conditions. So as you can see, we had a small increase, but still it was a significant increase. And so VR users experience more mental effort in the VR conditions than in the real condition. So we led 2 user studies to study the difference of mental effort in virtual versus in real environments. And our results support that wearing a VRHMD has a limited impact on the user's mental effort. Especially, we didn't find an effect in the sitting conditions, but we found an effect in the walking conditions. So this might be due to the fact that in the virtual conditions, the user didn't have any feedback of their body. We didn't use an avatar, so they didn't have any virtual body. And the fact that they couldn't see their feet in the virtual condition might be the reason why they experience more mental effort. Also, we have to control the amount of interactions and the amount of movement the user might do in the virtual conditions, because those might increase the user's mental effort. So walking increases the user's mental effort. So if you want to study different conditions on the user's mental effort and the users are moving differently, you have to control that. The response time, pressure exerted on the button, and the heart rate, which were the objective measures we collected, could be used as indicators of the user's mental effort, considering the fact that we have to take into account that the movement, and so because of the movement, we can have some motion artifacts. So it was the case, for example, for the heart rate. So for the second contributions, we proposed a methodology to introduce the mental workload in the design of complex training scenarios. So that was a research question we wanted to answer. So we decided to propose an approach depending on 3 main steps. So first, the state machine generations. So we had virtual environments. We wanted to identify the different tasks inside these virtual environments. And we wanted to identify the different difficulty levels inside each of these tasks. Based on these different task difficulty, we wanted to associate them together to form states of a state machines. So we wanted a state machine with the different possible task configurations. Next, for the mental workload assessment part, we wanted to measure the effect of the states on the user's mental workload and to put these mental workload measures inside the states of the state machine. Finally, for the scenario generation part, we want to use the state machines and the mental workload assessment inside the state machine in order to generate scenarios which are going to be able to modulate the mental workload over time. We developed a VR flight simulator in Become with a true-scale hardware part which matched the virtual cockpit in size and positions, and the user were instructed to go through the green circles, so the green circles there, and they were asked to follow the green line as closely as possible. So as you can see, the user were piloting the aircraft using the joystick with their right hand, and they were interacting with the different virtual interfaces with their left hand and the Vive controller. So we developed 3 tasks inspired by the MATB2, which is software developed by the NASA to study the operator's mental workload. And we decided to keep 3 main tasks. So the piloting task, and we modulated the piloting task difficulties by changing the speed of the aircraft and by increasing or decreasing the number of circles the users could see at a time. So somehow we manipulated the visibility of the trajectory. For the radio task, the user were asked to change the radio frequency depending on the audio message they were receiving in the audio headset. So this task was either deactivated or activated. And for the fuel task or resource management task, the user were asked to maintain 2 tanks levels inside an appropriate zone using different pump buttons. So it was the same as the radio task. So it was either deactivated or activated for the difficulty. So we used all task difficulties and we generated the state machines. So 3 by 2 by 2, we obtained 12 states inside the state machines. And this state was supposed to be the easiest one. And this state was supposed to be the hardest one. So going now into the data assessment part, we collected several types of measures. So first, the subjective mental workload assessment using the ISA scales. So the ISA scale is a scale with 5 different ratings. 1 meaning that the user is underloaded, that the users have a lot of remaining cognitive resources left. And 5 meaning that the users were overloaded and they could not complete the task completely, or it was quite difficult for them to do it. So we ask users to report the self-report their mental workload levels when the windows appeared in front of them. And these windows appeared every 30 seconds, basically, and 3 times per state. We also recorded performance and behavioral measures, but I'm not going to present you the result today. And we had 38 participants for the data assessment part. So we made users traverse all 12 states of the state machines in a randomized order. And in the end, we obtained the following map of mental workload levels inside the state machines. So in light blue, it means that the user's mental workload level was in average very low inside the state when they were exposed to this state inside the state machines. And the lowest state was 1.5 by 5 being the maximum. And the maximum average ISA level they experienced in average was 4.13. So we used these state machines to generate different scenarios. And so for the first scenario, we wanted to induce a medium mental workload level along to the users. So we chose the 5 states the closest to the ISA equals 3 inside the state machines. For the second scenario, we wanted to induce a surprise effect inside the scenarios. So we chose the 4 lowest ISA state, and we finally chose the one with the highest ISA state. And for the third scenario, we wanted to induce a progressive increase of mental workload over time. So we chose the lowest ISA state, the highest ISA state, and we chose the lowest transition cost between each state from the lowest to the highest. So here's the result for the first experiment. So it was for the data assessment part. So it was when all users traversed the 12th state of the state machine in a randomized order, and this was the mental workload progression we expected for each of the 3 scenarios we designed. So in this case, we had 38 participants who traversed the state machine in a randomized order. And here are the results for the second experiment when users traversed the state machine in a fixed order for each of the scenarios. So as you can see, we didn't find any significant effect between the first experiment and the second one, meaning that we managed to induce the expected mental workload progression over time. So we proposed a methodology to introduce mental workload assessment in VR training scenarios, and the scenario we designed using our approach were able to induce expected mental workload progression over time. And we had very interesting answer and results for the delays in response, which can impact the user's perception of the progression over the scenarios, but I'm not going to present this result today too. So for the third contribution, we proposed an all-in-one solutions to recognize in real time the user's mental workload levels in VR using physiological sensors directly integrated into a VR HMD. So we wanted to compare also different supervised learning setup on the user's mental workload recognition accuracy, because we decided to use supervised learning and more particularly the random forest algorithm to train the mental workload recognition models. So we wanted to classify different mental workload levels based on objective measures and based on previous tests, while random forest works especially well. So we wanted to compare different setups and wanted especially to see which sensor works the best to train the mental workload recognition models. So we trained different mental workload recognition models using sensors individually and different association of sensors to see how they interacted between them. And we sort of made a benchmark about which one works the best in our conditions on the mental workload recognition accuracy. Next, we wanted to see if integrating the sensors directly into the VRHMD was going to impact the user's mental workload recognition accuracy compared to commercial grade systems. So here we decided to use the Shimmer bracelet, which is quite spread in the academia world and in the industry. And we wanted to compare different signal normalization methods to take into account the individual differences between the users. I'm going to focus more especially on these 2 parts. And so for how did we integrate the hardware and the sensors inside the VRHMD? So we use an electronic card to stream the data to the computer. We have put this electronic card inside a 3D printed case, which was placed in the back of the VR headset. And in our case, we decided to use the HTC Vive Pro I, which has already an eye tracker embedded inside it. And we integrated a PPG sensor to measure the user's heart rate activity and a skin conductance sensor, so 2 electrodes to measure the user's skin conductance level inside the VR headset. So we had 75 participants, and we used the previously developed VR flight simulators and the previously developed methodology we proposed in order to try to induce balanced classes of mental workload levels. We had predictor variables, so many objective measures, and so we had physiological signals. So physiological signals from the HMD sensors, from the commercial grade sensors, so the Shimmer bracelet, and the pupil diameter from the Vive Pro eye tracker. We also recorded the user's piloting task performance, so the distance to the trajectory when the user passed the circles. And we tried to predict the user's subjective mental workload scores, so using the ISA scale. So we wanted to predict 4 classes of users' mental workload, so 1, 2, 3, and we merged 4 and 5 to have balanced classes. We synchronized the subjective mental workload score with the objective measures, and based on the subjective mental workload timestamp, we extracted the features before, during a time windows, based on the different physiological signals and the piloting task performances. So in the end, we had a data set where we had objective measures features. So for example, the heart rate, features related to the heart rate variability, to the skin conductance level, or to the task performance. And we labeled each of these objective features with a subjective data, so with one of the 4 classes of mental workload level. We decided to use a random forest algorithm to train the recognition model. And in the end, we obtained a mental workload recognition model. These are the results we obtained. So this is a confusion matrix. And on the top, you can see the ground truth, so the self-reported mental workload of the user reported. And on the left, you can see the result of the recognition model, so the mental workload level is the mental workload level accuracy. So we had a mean recognition accuracy of 65%, which is significantly better than chance level at 25%, considering that we had 4 classes. And this is actually very similar to what we had in the literature. And as you can see, it was quite encouraging to see that when the recognition model was wrong, it was mostly in adjacent classes. And as for the comparison of sensors, so here you can see the mental workload classification accuracy using different models when we used only ocular activity sensors, only epidermal activity features, or only different sensors features. So as you can see, the ocular activity features and the epidermal activity features worked especially well to train the mental workload recognition models compared to the performance measure and to the cardiac activity measures in our context, given our applications. And on the right, you can see that when we mix the sensors together, using all physiological sensors or using all physiological sensors plus the task performance measures, we only had a slight increase of mental workload recognition accuracy when we added the task performance measures. This is quite interesting because, well, if you are training a recognition model using the task performance measures, you are not going to be able to use this task performance, this recognition model in another context where you don't have this task performance, this task to do. So using only physiological signals is going to be more generic than using physiological signals plus task performance measures. And in our case, it didn't really add much to add these task performance measures. Also, for the comparison between the HMD sensor and the commercial grade sensors, so especially in the mixed measure cases, we had very similar recognition accuracy. And while having the VR, the sensors directly integrated into the VR headset is quite more convenient than using different sensors on the body. For the real-time processing, so we extracted physiological features inside the time windows of 30 seconds. We used these features to recognize the user's mental workload using the previously trained recognition model. And we sliced these time windows of 1 second step to update the recognition mental workload level of the users. So here is a real-time interface, and on the left, you can see the physiological signals. So you can see the epidermal activity evolutions over time. You can see the heart rate activity, so the blood volume pulse using the PPG sensors, which is evolving over time too. And you can see the pupil dilations. And on the right, you can see the mental workload predictions. So this is the mental workload recognition's accuracy for each 4 classes we try to predict. And this is refreshed and updated every 1 second, as explained earlier. So we proposed an all-in-one solutions to recognize the user's mental workload in VR in real time using physiological sensors integrated into VR HMD. And we were able to predict 4 classes of mental workload level in real time with 65% average accuracy. And we gave some insight about the impact of the different supervised learning setups on the mental workload recognition accuracy. Basically, integrating sensors inside the VRHMD is going to result in very similar recognition accuracy as using commercial grade systems in our conditions when the user was seated, so maybe more tests will be needed. And the ocular activity and epidermal activity features work especially well to train the mental workload recognition models. And finally, so this I didn't represent this result, but overall normalizations really improved the mental workload recognition models accuracy. So we have to use Bayesian features and to integrate them inside the training of the models to improve the mental workload recognition models accuracy. So for the general conclusions, we conducted we proposed 3 contributions. And in the first contributions, we studied the user's mental effort while wearing a VRHMD compared to in the real environment. And we found out that wearing a VRHMD had a limited impact on the user's mental effort. Interactions and differences in representations, for example, differences in the avatar representations, have to be controlled because they can impact the user's mental effort, they can increase it. For the second contribution, we proposed a methodology to introduce mental workload assessment in the design of VR training scenarios. And the methodology we proposed managed to induce the expected mental workload progression over time. And finally, for the third contributions, we proposed only-one solutions to recognize the user's mental workload in real time using physiological sensors integrated into a VRHMD. So the solution we proposed allowed to recognize the user's mental workload with 65% average accuracy, and we gave some insight about the effect of different setups on the mental workload recognition accuracy. For short-term perspective, we could try to study the impact of different factors on the user's mental workload in VR compared to in the real world. So for example, we didn't really assess the effect of latency, frame rate, field of view, which could impact the user's mental workload in some aspects. So there have been some studies which found out that the impact of latency, there was an impact of latency on physiological features. So we could expect the same on the user's mental effort or the user's mental workload maybe. Also, we consider an auditory task for the back task and a visual task for the walking task, but we could try to study the effect of the nature of the task on the user's mental workload in VR, considering the effect of multisensory feedback in VR to see which one is the most important to not trigger any increase in cognitive demands. For the effect of VR devices, so we only consider VRHMD, but you have a lot of different headsets and a lot of different VR devices out there. So you have, for example, cave-like systems, and you have ergonomical factors, which we have to consider because, well, we can expect them to increase the user's mental workload. As for the introduction of mental workload in VR, so we consider discrete task difficulties, but we could try to extend the methodology to continuous task difficulty, which would be very interesting to make it a little bit more generic. Also, we could try to consider other stimuli, for example, virtual agents, for example, guides, other kind of stimuli, so instructions, for example, and we could try to consider collaborative aspects, mixing this kind of methodology with existing frameworks, relying, for example, on Petri nets representation, graph sets, or other kinds of graph networks. For the recognition of mental workload in VR, so we didn't consider brain-computer interfaces measures in the mental workload recognition model, but we know that in the literature, we had very impressive results using EEG or NIRS on the user's mental workload. And we would like to try to integrate this kind of measures inside the VR headset and to compare this kind of measures to, for example, more wearable and the autonomic nervous system activity measures. So heart rate activity, for example, skin conductance activity. Also, we could try to investigate the robustness of integrating the HMD sensors inside the VR headset, considering different VR usages. So in our experiment, the user was seated, but we could try to make the user do different kind of interactions in VR, different kind of locomotions, and see where the sensors, in which place we have to place the sensors for them to be the most robust. And also, we could try to investigate the mental workload recognition model genericity, training, for example, the mental workload recognition model in one specific context, and trying to use this mental workload recognition model in another context. So by leading this work, we wanted to go to our more robust VR applications, which were able to take into account the user psychological state, and wanted to provide unique experience to adapt it to each user. But while we didn't really close the loop, even if we tackle a little bit of each of these research axes, and there's still a lot more work to do. So for example, for the induction of mental workload, what we could expect to do in the future would be to develop standardized tasks or battery of tasks in order to study the humans and the users' mental workload levels in VR. So VR has a very powerful engagement effect on the users. So we can engage them cognitively and emotionally. And because of that, it could be interesting to try to use all of these opportunities offered by VR in order to try to develop this kind of induction methods. For the recognition of mental workload, so as you know, machine learning and deep learning are making incredible breakthrough in the world at the moment. So it's moving very fast. And well, considering the fact that it's moving very fast, we would have to consider the new methods and the methods which are going to be developed in the future in order to improve the mental workload recognition models. Also, as you know, we don't have a lot of data, physiological data available open source. And it could be interesting to try to make a sort of ImageNet database of physiological signals labeled using psychological states. For the exploitations, so as you know, there are very few studies making a loop, so looping and adapting based on the user's psychological state, even if a lot of them are mentioning the fact that that could be very interesting. And well, we will need more user studies in different applications in different fields in order to study if actually taking into account the user psychological state and how taking into account state is going to benefit the users and the user's performance level. So one thing we would like to do in the future is to extend the approach to other affective and cognitive states. So we only consider mental workload in my PhD, but considering emotions, personality traits, and anxiety levels, for example, could be quite interesting and would be the logical next step. So this led us to define a new field of study. So affective and cognitive virtual reality as a study of virtual reality systems and applications that induce, recognize, or exploit affective and cognitive states. And I hope that this work are going to inspire researchers to develop affective and cognitive virtual reality systems and studies. This PhD work has led to papers and presentations in international conferences, a submitted journal paper, and a patent. And I would like to especially thank my supervisors as well as all the people involved in this work. So the participants to my experiment, the hardware engineers who worked on the physiological headset, for example. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I really hope that I managed to keep your mental workload very stable during these presentations.